At a nearby shipping company, I work the graveyard shift, counting inventory and ensuring that all shipments and commodities are tracked throughout the entire organizing process make up the majority of my work. I occasionally work the same shift as a coworker, but most of the time it's just me. There was nothing special about this night. My manager checked me in when I arrived at the warehouse, closed it up, and left me on my own. I began going about my usual business, reviewing every cargo that arrived during the day. About an hour into my shift, as I was doing so, I noticed a door that was slightly ajar, as if it were closed, yet it wasn't attached to the entryway. It was therefore somewhat protruding. Truckers would typically enter by this particular entrance, which was located at the rear of the structure. When I opened it, I saw a calm, deserted yard behind the warehouse. There is absolutely nothing to see. My manager must have simply forgotten to lock it, I reasoned. I couldn't lock it or anything because I didn't have the key to any of these side access doors, but to be honest, I didn't give a damn. For me, at least, it wasn't a huge deal. I closed it and resumed my inventory counting. I was working rather quickly, finishing a respectable amount of work and moving on to the next aisle of shelves when I caught a glimpse of something moving at the far end of the corridor out of the corner of my eye. I looked up right away, but there was nothing. From the corner of my eye, it appeared as though someone was sprinting across the hallway's entrance back there. For a brief while, it made my heart race, but I assumed it was some strange trick my mind was doing on me. I massaged my eyes and shook my head, wondering what was wrong with me. I pondered whether or not to check on it, but at first I chose not to because I was 99% certain it was nothing, and walking all the way down there would slow down my workflow. Like situations like this happen all the time, thinking you. Every other time you see something in the corner of your eye, it turns out to be nothing. Why would this be any different then? However, as the minutes went by, I couldn't get rid of the slight suspicion that it might have been someone. I proceeded to the end of the corridor with a sigh, feeling a little let down by myself for being so disturbed by this. Since it has nothing to do with my work, I hardly ever visit this part. It's merely a collection of large pallets that are ready to be sent out of the warehouse or arranged on shelves. As I'm not employed there, the majority of the lights were off. I simply stood in the corridor and observed. I waited for a few seconds in the big black room to see if anything moved, but nothing did. I walked out of the corridor and returned to my previous workspace. I'm not sure if it was because of that minor circumstance, but I felt as though I had just been struck by a wave of fatigue. All of a sudden, I was exhausted and didn't want to work as fast as I had only minutes before. I desired to complete this aisle. But before I took my break, I continued working as a result. However, it didn't take me even 5 minutes to see something in the side of my vision once more. Towards the end, I jerked my eyes of the corridor. I swear it appeared as though someone or a person was observing me from around the corner. But suddenly there was nothing. This time I dropped what I was doing and rushed to the end of the corridor. Once more, though, I couldn't really see much because it was so dark. I called out, figuring it was worth a shot, even though I wasn't really expecting a response. "Hi there." After a short wait, I moved deeper into the space. It was really silent. My every stride reverberated across the entire warehouse. About halfway through, I stopped, through and surveyed the area. I had a really uncomfortable and unnerving sense that I was being observed while I stood there. It was made worse by the inability to see anything. I quickly returned to my starting point, reaching the other end of the hallway before I took another look back. I felt cold in that room because of its obscurity. As I turned to return to my job, there was a huge thump that echoed throughout the warehouse. It sounded metallic, as if someone had struck a massive shelf unit with metal. After then, there was a brief period of quiet during which only the room's weak echoes could be heard. And then there was another thud. This time it was quieter, like a repeating striking the metal shelf with a tap. They seemed to be attempting to attract my attention in order to entice me to return to the dimly lit room. But now that I realized this had to be a person, I fled because I was so appalled. I entered the parking lot through the back door. I called for assistance after getting to a safe distance. At least not immediately. I didn't have high expectations for the police. However, unexpectedly when they went, they discovered someone concealed in the dimly lit chamber behind one of the big shelves. It was a man in his 40s who had an eerie, untidy appearance. Even more unsettling, though, is the fact that they discovered him strolling around the exterior of the building multiple times over the past week and making sure every door was unlocked. I spent all these nights by myself in the warehouse, sometimes just across the door from him. Based on my brief observation of him being hauled out of the warehouse and into the police car, The man appeared to be rather insane. The thought of him attempting to get me into the room makes me wonder if they ever truly realized out what he was trying to do. Still gives me a lot of anxiety. I worked part-time nighttime shifts at my parents' round-the-clock laundromat when I was in college. It was merely a dingy spot on the outskirts of town. For what it was, the structure had always seemed strangely eerie to me. There was something unnerving about the location's age and the background hum of the equipment. However, I continued to believe that working at a place my parents owned was preferable to working anywhere else. It was Friday, which was I worked a whole overnight shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. only one day. My dad left me some munchies in the back room and instructed me to call and wake him as usual when I took over. For the following hour, there were still a few people coming in, so I stayed behind the counter to make sure everything went as planned. By midnight, every machine was empty and everyone had left. I waited another 15 minutes behind the counter. Minutes simply lounging on my phone and holding off on any cleaning duties for a little while longer. However, a consumer entered within that period. I was a little perplexed as I looked up. He didn't have any clothes or laundry with him, any type. His hands were in his pockets and he was wearing a heavy hoodie with the hood over his head. He didn't look at me or respond when I said hello. He simply entered and moved carefully through the washer aisles and dryers, sort of scanning the area, I suppose, before returning to the entrance and excluding the doors. He strolled out into the parking lot and I couldn't help but stare. He didn't get into a car or anything. He simply left after crossing the street. Sight. It's not common for someone to enter a laundromat in the middle of the night and simply stroll around. Although he didn't technically do anything wrong, I felt quite uncomfortable about it. Being by myself there didn't help at all. I believe I would have felt safer, and perhaps not have even seen anything if there had been other patrons inside. But since there was nothing I could do about it, I just got to work cleaning. The only explanation I could think of for the man entering and moving around as I was cleaning was that he might be searching for a piece of clothing he may have dropped earlier in the day. Asking me if I had seen it was the logical thing to do, but he didn't, so it was a stretch. That's quite. For the next 20 minutes or so, while I moved around, wiped off every counter, and organized the space, this was all I could think about. However, I eventually looked up from what I was doing and saw that guy from earlier standing just outside the entryway. I didn't even recognize the person behind the glass because it was dark outside, and he was dressed entirely in black. He had already begun to leave by the time I noticed him. How much time did he spend standing there? For what purpose are you monitoring me? After a short while, I approached the door and peered down the storefront as closely as I could, but the man had already left. I was unable to even see where he went. Something about the way he looked and the unsettling way he was suddenly appearing seemed incredibly unsettling and uncomfortable. I considered phoning my dad, but it would have been terrible to wake him up and have him take over my shift because of a person I found a little strange. I was aware that my father wouldn't. I was still in my first few months of employment and wanted to demonstrate my dependability, so I gave it a hard time about it. For the next hour, I remained vigilant, essentially sitting behind the bar and gazing out the front windows. Following farther, and however, as time went on and there were still no clients, I gradually began to pay less attention. For a while, I was using my phone to pass the time until I heard a few brief creak sounds coming from the rear of the structure. I stood up and took a few steps in the direction of the rear, attempting to pay attention. In one of the rear rooms, I could hear what sounded like someone moving objects or shuffling around. After just a few seconds of listening, I realized I had to go since I knew someone was back there. I turned and crept stealthily to the front door, pushing on it to go out while getting ready to call the police. However, the door became jammed. It refused to open. Glancing down, I could see through the glass that there was something surrounding the outside handles of the entrance. When I noticed the man standing at the door observing me, I knew right away that was what he was doing outside the building. Panic took over my entire body. The rear exit door was the only one. I began stealthily approaching the back room where I could still hear them moving objects, but they were doing everything very carefully, as if they were attempting to keep quiet. I spotted him when I reached the doorway and peered inside. He had his back to me as he was looking through a few of the floor-level crates. I then turned to face the exit. This was my opportunity. I ran to the door. The man turned around and saw me right away. When I reached the door, my heart briefly fell. The handle had an improvised-looking rope wound around it as if he was attempting to secure it. Luckily, I was still able to push it open and flee because whatever he tried didn't work. The man emerged from the building as soon as I did. However, he didn't pursue me now that I was in the open. He simply fled. The cops and my dad arrived, but there weren't many leads on possible destinations. That dude was obviously attempting to lure me inside with him. He was probably attempting to do it covertly, but I had to search for a way to secure the rear exit door, which eventually enabled me to. When I did, I fled. He probably had terrible intentions. It seems absurd that I didn't realize anything was seriously wrong until the very last minute. When I'm looking back at the entire evening, I'm at least 1,000 times more conscious now when I'm working alone and never believing that anyone is genuinely harmless, since I am aware that there would have been no way out if that man had been successful in locking the rear door. For me, I worked as a data entry clerk for a private corporation for a few years. It was your average low-level position with little respect at work. Under the data entry title, the managers were continuously adding more and more tasks that I wasn't even meant to be performing. However, this was my first real job and I was young. I simply accepted it. The workplace was now located in a tiny business district in the suburbs just outside the city, on the 5th and top floor of a sizable office building. Only our business had the 5th floor, while various businesses rented out the remaining levels. Since all of these other companies, as far as I knew, were service-oriented, their offices would close by 5 or 6 o'clock every night. The only one that occasionally required employees to work later as data entry clerks, essentially doing every other strange job too. On certain occasions, I was the one who stayed up late doing whatever hectic task needed to be done. They didn't mind paying me to work extra hours after closure because I was the lowest paid employee. My supervisor gave me a lot of tasks to complete. He didn't even ask whether I could stay up late. He simply thought I was capable of doing it, and since I was a pushover at the time, I accepted it. The extra cash was usually helpful. Additionally, I really enjoyed my work more when the office was empty, since I didn't have to worry about being watched and micromanaged all day. At 6 o'clock, everyone else left to go home, but I stayed to finish my task. The building's main lights went out after 30 minutes, only keeping the low-power lights on. I worked at a comfortable speed while sitting at the computer and going through the motions. 3 entire hours passed. I had just been concentrating on my task in the calm, dark building when I heard something underneath me all of a sudden. The sound was obviously quite muted and echoey due to the large building and all of its rooms, but I thought it sounded like a door opening or closing. I took a little break from my computer to listen in an attempt to identify what it might have been, but I didn't hear anything more, so I returned to my work. I honestly didn't give it much thought. I didn't think it was likely that I heard a door. Instead, I assumed it was just the structure creaking and settling. After that, I didn't hear anything that would have led me to consider it further. I would estimate that 30 to 45 minutes went by after that. Almost all of the tasks I had to complete were completed. I believe I only needed to finish about an hour's worth of tasks before I could go for home. However, it was getting quite late at night and I could feel my eyes feeling drowsy. I got up to get a little cup of coffee from the Keurig by the door of the office. I went over and got the brew going. I'm not sure how I missed it for the entire stroll to the coffee station. However, as I made my way back to my desk with my coffee in hand, I saw that the hallway door was open. The utility closet and the stairway leading to the other floors were located at the rear of the room. Since hardly anyone used that door, it was always closed. I approached the doorway out of curiosity and simply stuck my head out to take a look around. I noticed that the closet door and the stairs door were both closed and empty. However, I did have a cold that kind of filled me when I was over there, with a sense of unease. However, I assumed that was simply due to the weak lighting in that hallway. It was really gloomy and eerie at night. I approached the stairwell door, double-checked, and then returned to I went back to my work, after shutting the door behind me. There was hardly an hour left in my workday. There was nothing to worry about if I could just finish it and leave. But it was pretty odd that the door was open, and I was aware there was no justification for anyone to come up here and remain silent. It was challenging, but I made an effort to continue working and finish it as soon as possible. I had the unsettling sensation that I was being observed every few minutes. When I looked up from the screen, I would see nothing. I became annoyed since I knew it was detracting from my concentration and prolonging the process. However, the emotion was so intense that I couldn't resist checking every time. This continued for half an hour. However, everything around me turned dark while I was staring at the screen. Suddenly, all of the faint overhead lights went out. The only light in the room came from the faint white computer screen. all around me. Everything else was completely dark. I quickly turned to face the other side of the room where I knew the light switches were, and got up to get over there, but I halted before I could move. In the building's quiet, I could hear the steady, gentle footfall of someone approaching me from that direction, one after the other, coming from the shadows beyond the computer screen's light. For a few while, I was paralyzed in terror as I listened, but then my adrenaline surged and I bolted from my desk. I headed directly for the stairs door. At last, there was some light when I reached the hallway and entered the staircase. Until I reached the first floor and left the building, I continued to run. Then, of course, I dialed 911. Until an officer showed up, I remained outside the building in the cold for almost 15 minutes. After that, I had to wait 5 more minutes for 2 more cops until the building was ultimately searched. They discovered no one inside by that point. Even more annoying, it took 2 days to receive the security footage. In any case, it wasn't very beneficial. It was an ancient building with a 30-year-old black and white security system that was so pixelated and hazy that it was impossible to see anything. They only knew that the individual had entered the premises at approximately 2 p.m., claiming to have a meeting with one of the other businesses. After that, he essentially immediately hid in the utility closet until everyone, aside from me, left. He strolled around for some time before realizing I was still there. Furthermore, it's unclear what he was attempting at that time to carry out or what he desired. Perhaps he was merely attempting to frighten me into leaving the office. Or perhaps he intended something darker. But after that, I made the decision to give up without coming to a firm conclusion. For many reasons, I'm delighted I did. But not having to be by myself in that building following that incident was significant, particularly considering that he still has never discovered.